أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
Hello everyone and welcome to Conversations about Beauty and Islamic Theology, a series where we explore the rich and diverse intersections between theology, art and mysticism. Now today it is our absolute pleasure to host Dr. Hasan al-Khoee. Dr. Hasan al-Khoee is currently a research associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, London. He completed his doctorate at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he focused on political oratory traditions in the first century of the hijra and the early Arabic historiographical tradition. Today, we hope to discuss some of the ideas that emerge in Dr. al-Khoee's fascinating research on oratory in early Islam. Dr. Hasan al-Khoee, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So perhaps we could start out with a rather broad question, which is, what is oration?
That is a broad question, and I think pinning it down has been something people have been trying to do for a while. But I think an oration can generally be described as any kind of formal public discourse. It's generally seen as something that's elevated and dignified in language, usually used in kind of ceremonial or momentous settings. But in regards to the Arabic historical tradition, and here from my research, I'm mainly focusing on the first century of Islam. By oration, we generally mean the khutba, which essentially is a public speech and can be defined as a kind of formal discourse, which, according to Professor Qutbuddin's definition, is generally defined as an oral speech that's being composed live, as in at the moment, during the moment, orally delivered to a large audience, during which the orator stands and faces the audience. But what I think the central sort of cusp of it is that it's a public discourse marking a particularly momentous event, even though what we mean by momentous actually can be quite relative, because the circumstances in which an oration can be delivered are so varied, from religious context to political contexts to marriage context, for example. But generally speaking, by oration, we're looking at the term khutbah, with the khatib being the orator himself. And even though in the early Arabic tradition is actually quite exceptional for having a number of famous female orations, it's what's noticeable that in Ibn Manzur's definition of, or sort of derivation of where the word khutbah comes from, he derives it as something related to an important event or a calamity, because he says khutbahs were generally so named precisely because they were only delivered on momentous or catastrophic occasions.
Thank you so much for opening that up for us. And just to go back to something you said, you mentioned that the khutbahs were delivered live, so that the khatib, or the person giving the sermon, is basically freestyling. I mean, yeah. Did people receive any training for, oratory, for oration in that early period, or was it?
I mean, that's a very good question. I think one of the signs of a good orator, and this is something that continues well into, say, the 10th century, is that ability to compose a well-crafted, beautiful, aesthetically pleasing speech live or extemporaneously. The Fatimid Khalif al-Mansur, for example, becomes very well regarded for his ability precisely to do that. If we look at the first century, however, that seems to be one of the central features of the khutbah. Now, in regard to training, what we find is by the 9th and 10th centuries, you begin to see these commentaries, especially from literary critics, regarding what what should be a good khutbah, what should go into a good khutbah, how to adorn your khutbah, how a khutbah can be constructed, what shouldn't be there. They even go as far as, for example, Al-Jahid Ibn would go as far to describe the good qualities of a khatib, the bad qualities of a khatib. As for the bad qualities, one of them is that you shouldn't stutter, you shouldn't have any kind of lisp, you shouldn't play with your beard when giving your khutbah. As for the good qualities, you know, it comes from sort of clear enunciation, but also essentially it boils down to eloquence and ability to, or balagha, or ability to be clear in expression. But when we're looking at the period of the 1st century, which really, this sort of the 6th to 7th century, from pretty much the time of the Prophet until the early Abbasid period, is what's generally known as sort of the kind of high watermark of the classical Arabic khutbah. Here we find that most of the khatibs, or most of the famous khatibs, are famous because of their ability to craft a khutbah, because of their ability. And that's why, for example, whether in the early Islamic tradition or the medieval Islamic tradition, or sort of modern scholarship, you find Imam Ali being called a master orator. And you have other figures, for example, a number of pre-Islamic figures, a number of early Islamic figures who are also known, who are also particularly famed for their ability in pronouncing a khutbah. But as for training, I think it's something that was, now in some cases, for example, like in the case of Khalid al-Qasri, who was another famous orator and Umayyad governor. And it's, I mean, one of the important points is that most of the famous khatibs were either prominent religious leaders or prominent political leaders. In the case of Khalid al-Qasri, we have an account that talks about him memorizing, or his father told him to memorize thousands of speeches in order that he can sort of imbue all the particular features within himself. And then he says, once I had learned all of these speeches, then I forgot them, and then I was able to pronounce them sort of perfectly myself. In the case of, for example, the famous Umayyad scribe Abdul Hamid al-Katib, he says that even though he's famed for his writings in the epistolographic tradition, he says that he tried to memorize as many of Imam Ali's speeches as he could. And so because of this kind of memorization, therefore they sort of become imbued within the individual themselves. We don't see any kind of formal training in that sense, I think, other than that exposure to what is a good speech, because the kind of literary techniques that become identified and sort of become formulated in a particular way, we only really see that codified after the sort of 8th and 9th century and well into the medieval period. So I think for the period that we're looking at, especially the 1st century, it was much more of a skill that people acquired, but not without kind of any formal sort of training or pedagogy or anything like that.
That's fascinating, because it sounds like part of the oratory process is an aesthetic experience, right? Whether in terms of the sight of the khatib, you know, shouldn't be playing with his beard, or the sense of sound, right? You shouldn't be stuttering, or he or she should have a particular eloquence to the speech that he or she is delivering. I wanted to return also to this link that you mentioned with Ali ibn Abi Talib, because, you know, as art historians often argue, the kind of minbar itself is meant to be this kind of symbolic, is meant to form a symbolic connection between the khatib and the Prophet Muhammad. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that the Ali ibn Abi Talib is kind of elevated as one of the original figures that is celebrated for his eloquence, right? Mm-hmm. Not only in poetry, but you're saying also in the kind of oratory tradition. Is there a sense of that? Does that kind of emerge in your kind of research, where the khatib is a kind of figure that is somehow related to Ali ibn Abi Talib?
I think because of the position and status of Imam Ali in the Shiite tradition, especially, then of course there's always going to be this question of, to what extent is this, to what extent are some of these ascriptions later projections? But I think it's the ubiquity of his fame in regarding his eloquence and the power of his speeches and the potency of his khutbas, we find some of the earliest collections of khutbas in the Arabic historical tradition from the 9th and 10th century, the earliest compilations, because we only begin to see actual sort of compilations focused on speeches, literary compilations. Some of the earliest ones were particularly focused on collecting and collating the speeches of Imam Ali. In the same way, we find that by the 10th century, the famous compilation that becomes Nahj al-Balagha, or the peak of, literally the peak of eloquence, compiled by Sharif al-Radi in the early 11th century, This becomes seen as almost the jewel, the climax of the khutbah tradition. And these are all speeches attributed to Imam Ali. And the Nahj al-Balagha over the following century then becomes a major source for understanding what the khutbahs were, major source for exposition. Within 2 centuries, you have numerous commentaries on it, the most famous one being the Sharh Nahj al-Balagha by Ibn Abi al-Hadid. So very much this idea of the master orator and the figure of Imam Ali are very, very closely linked from the early Islamic tradition, Arabic tradition onwards. What you said regarding the minbar is very interesting because the history of the minbar is fascinating. And it's one that I think it's one of those subjects that in the early 20th century was, by historians, was really picked up because of its significance and where did the idea of the minbar come from and how is it related to the figure of the orator. And because in the minbar and in oration, you really have a kind of, oration especially, you really have a kind of conjoining of notions of political authority, notions of religious authority, also and aesthetic art, which all sort of come together through the figure of the orator. And so the relationship of the minbar and the orator and their overall relationship with authority in the early Islamic period is one that, as I said, was in the early 20th century, was quite prominent. And then I think it became mainly, it was mainly art historians who really sort of took the study of the minbar, like for example, the Qutubiyya minbar in Qayrawan, or all these early famous minbars, but as a symbol of oration and as a symbol of oratory. It's only really in recent years and recent decades has sort of its significance being picked up. I mean, when I started my thesis research a lifetime ago, a lot of the work done on the khutbah, or the symbolism of it, the function of it, but especially the aesthetics of it, really was quite, by that point, so by the early 2000s, was quite dated. A lot of it still relied on sort of major works done in the early 20th century. There were a number of important Arabic works on the literary features or the stylistic aesthetic features of the khutbah, but in terms of this kind of political symbolic significance, there wasn't that much done. By the time I had finished, thankfully, Professor Tahir Qutbuddin in 2019's work on Arabic oratory really has been amazing, because it's essentially really sort of defined the contours of so many of the major aspects, especially as relating to aesthetics and stylistics and some of the symbolic features. But as a field, there's a huge amount of work left to be done. And one of those areas is on particularly this significance of the minbar in relation to notions of authority.
So it sounds like, just to change gears a bit, but it sounds like the kind of charismata of the khatib, of the orator, really relies on this, or is constructed upon this kind of interplay between this kind of spiritual heritage, as well as this important aesthetic element, as well as the pure charisma or ability or talent of the speaker to express certain ideas. And we spoke about this in the context of the khutbah. Can you speak to us perhaps about some of the other contexts for oration in the early Islamic tradition?
So I think by what you mean is that essentially, first thing is critical to remember that we're dealing with a highly oral milieu, a context in which writing at this stage was still in its early stages. Here again, we're talking about the sort of early 7th to perhaps mid-8th century. It's a highly oral context in which the major forms of literary, and by literary here I mean anything essentially verbal, the major forms of any literary production are done in an oral form. So while the khutbah oration is the prominent prose form, we also have poetry. We also have the Quran. We also have series of what we can call public speeches or homiletics that some would include within the kind of khutbah context, but others would say, well, they wouldn't necessarily be direct khutbahs. Things like the reading out of stories, or homiletics, for example, pronouncements of wa'ad, or the pronouncements of dhikr. Professor Qutbuddin would classify these as khutbahs, but in the general context, we really mainly have the khutbah, poetry, and the Quran as the principal forms of any kind of public pronouncements, even though they wouldn't necessarily, even though, for example, poetry wouldn't be a public speech. But the khutbah is the principal prose form that we're looking at. Now, for example, we have multiple variations in the kinds of functions a khutbah can have. And this is it's a very broad umbrella. So you can have, for example, a religious khutbah, a pious khutbah, a khutbah focusing on admonition or exhortation to good works. These would generally be classified as wa'ad. But then, for example, you could also have the political khutbah. You could have the khutbah on the military battlefield. You could have khutbahs regarding legislation. You can have ceremonial khutbahs. You could have khutbahs relating to marriage, which is one of the legacies of the whole khutbah, the 7th to 8th century khutbah practice that continues on to today. So by oration, generally speaking, we're looking at either the khutbah itself or very closely related khutbah practices, which probably would come under the umbrella of the khutbah. Otherwise, what we're looking for really is any kind of prominent public speech. Now, one of the difficulties I had during the course of my research was actually, how do we classify speeches, public speeches, that don't seem to fall into the pattern of what a khutbah is? Because remember, a khutbah is also quite structurally conservative, and it's got quite a specific formula that need to be pronounced. And even though there's the question of when that was actually settled, or whether it was settled in such an early period, is still open. So you have a huge range of settings where people could give speeches, could give some kind of public speeches at the Caliph's court, in the mosque, in the market, in a courtyard. You also have a number of major symbolic associations. Sorry, you also have a major number of symbolic communicative practices that are closely related to the khutbah, but may not directly be part of it. For example, ways of communicating to the public, and by the public here, it's a very broad term, particular notions, particular ideas, the use of banners, for example, the use of slogans. Slogans being one of those, one of the areas I looked at quite deeply in my work. And so you have this kind of broad series of oratory practices, or practices that can be related to public communication. But in terms of actual formal oratory, we're always coming back to the khutbah again.
So it's a fascinating idea, because as far as I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're suggesting that the khutbah really is the defining paradigm for the speech in the early Islamic period. And when there are speeches that are given outside of that particular context, they are still in some way structurally or aesthetically related to the khutbah in some kind of way.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you know, it's been, I think, widely accepted now that the khutbah is the preeminent prose form in the first century of Islam, and its legacy is enormous in terms of, but it's the kind of epistles that we see written in the sort of 8th century and the 9th century, and the legacy that the epistles have. A lot of this comes from the khutbah practices of the 1st century. The way books are composed today, so for example, the introduction of most Arabic books in the medieval period will always begin with, as you would have seen in your work, will always begin with a particular praise formula, the hamdulillah, which is itself called the khutbah of the book. And this is a direct borrowing, or a direct legacy, rather, sorry, a direct inheritance of the particular structural features of the khutbah. And so what we find is that the khutbah essentially really becomes this kind of foundational bedrock, and particular aspects of it, this foundational bedrock upon which written Arabic literature over the following centuries inherits a significant amount.
So even the kind of opening sections of texts, but outside of public speech, even those are in some way related to the khutbah.
Oh, absolutely, because the khutbah essentially, and again, I'll go back to Professor Tahir Qutbuddin's categorization here. The khutbah essentially consists of 5 major parts, or 5 major structures. Now, the question of whether this was actually always the case, or whether this was kind of a classical backwards projection of what all khutbah should look like. But one of the central features of the khutbah was the first, which was the tahmid, the praise of God. By almost, as far as the early Arabic tradition is concerned, almost every single khutbah we find begins with a praise of God. This could be in numerous forms, but generally speaking would be Alhamdulillah or Nahmadullah, or it would be a command to the audience for them to praise God. And quite often what was fascinating is the way this, even though it was always considered the first part of the khutbah, the way it was molded to fit the context. And this is where the sort of craft of being a khatib comes in. The way it was molded to fit the context of what the speech itself was, the theme, the major thematic focus of the speech. This became widely accepted as a necessary feature of any khutbah. So much so that khutbahs that begin without the hamdulillah or without the tahmid would be known as maimed khutbahs. The famous one given by the Umayyad governor of Iraq in the late 7th century, Ziyad bin Abi, which becomes widely known in the historical tradition as khutbah batra, which means maimed, because it doesn't begin with the hamdulillah. And there are also certain features of the hamdulillah. For example, often it would be in parallelism, and parallelism was perhaps the central aesthetic feature of the whole khutbah. Often it would be in either assonance or consonant rhyme. And we find this part of the khutbah, the tahmid of the khutbah, becoming again the central feature of, or sort of the introductory feature of so many of the later written traditions. And again, it's fascinating that whether in the 12th or 13th or 15th century, this introductory hamdulillah, which again usually rhymed, or whether a consonant rhyme or assonance rhyme, what would be called the khutbah of the book. So you can see that sort of close association there.
I mean, for me, that's absolutely, for me, it's mind-blowing. And to be honest, I never really thought about it, but until you kind of spoke about it now, which is the khutbah is the thing that people would have to tune into. So people would have to tune into every single week and partake in this kind of experience. It's so fundamental, it's so powerful. And we spoke to Professor Samar Akkash about cosmology and pre-modern Islamic architecture, and he refers to this idea of spatial sensibility, this idea that pre-modern mystics would construct the universe in a particular way. They would have a particular idea of the way that God has ordered everything. And we see some of this ordering, this kind of ordering influences people's sensibility, the way they experience the world. And we see that reflected in art and architecture. And it kind of resonates with what you're saying in some way, because you're suggesting, again, as far as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that people's experience of the khutbah is somehow creating like a sensibility, which is then reflected into literature or reflected into writing, where if people are not writing, it just seems normative to write or structure a book in this particular way, because it's related to what is done in this paradigmatic speech that is given every single week.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think it's, and again, I'm going to refer to Professor Tahir Qutbuddin's work. It's fascinating the extent to which, when we look back at khutbahs or khutbah practices, how we today, in a very writerly culture, in a very literary culture where everything is based on reading and writing and texts, how it's quite, at times, hard to think of a society where even the majority of literary production, the majority of artistic literary production, was done in a completely oral context. And there's been a significant amount of work on oral cultures, orality, since the beginning of the 20th century. But one thing that becomes, for me, that was always fascinating, was how the thought processes of people living in oral countries were themselves often quite defined by the fact that they're living in an oral society. And so particular ways of speaking, particular ways of thinking quite often were defined and molded by this prominence of orality. And central to that, for example, is mnemonics, where within any kind of public discourse, there would always be particular rhythm of speech, parallelism, particular patterns, in order to facilitate the memorization of the speech, to facilitate how the speech is heard and received. And it's been, again, this is a subject that's been, so we're going into a quite separate but a larger subject. These often have physiological consequences, or sort of physiological contexts, because it's related to the way people breathe, and it's related to how the human mind works. Essentially, the human mind, as neuroscientists have now in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, has become a major focus of research for them. So much of how memory works is related to patterns, which is why, we can all think of a particularly awful ditty or melody that's come into your brain and stuck in your brain for the next, usually it's a kid's rhyme or a toddler's rhyme, that sticks in your head for the next 4 or 5 days because of the very basic pattern it works, and how the human mind likes, or sort of can retain things according to particular patterns. And so in oral culture, the way people spoke was often related in a way that pattern, and therefore rhythm, because rhythm is a kind of flow of patterns in sort of brief, very, very briefly defined, in a kind of rhythm. And so this rhythmic, this necessity for things to be rhythmic really defined how the khutbah was, what the khutbah was. Because on the one hand, you have, the khutbah has a particular, so if we can just like, look at structurally, the khutbah has a particular structure. It begins with the tahmeed, which is the praise of God. Usually there's not always, but almost, and for example, we wouldn't have to think hard to think back on the kinds of tahmeeds that we've heard in Friday prayers over a lifetime. The famous one being, for example, the tahmeed found in the reports of the early khutbahs of the Prophet Muhammad. Alhamdulillah, nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa natubu ilayhi wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa sayyiati a'malina man yahdi Allah fala mudilla lahu wa man yudhilla fala hadiya lahu. This standard tahmeed, or variants of it, I think everyone has memorized, or everyone who's sort of grown up in a context of Friday prayers has in one way or another memorized. Then you have the transition phase. So that's almost part one. Then you have the transition phase, the Amma Ba'd, which is again one of those phrases that you see so people struggling to translate it, but essentially it marks the separator between the tahmid and the khutbah. Then you have the third sort of part, which is a direct address to the audience. And this could be this will obviously depend on who the audience is. It could be, oh believers, Ya Ahl al-Islam, or Ya Ayyuh, or it could be, for example, it could be Ya Ahl al-Iraq, or people of Iraq. Most commonly it would be Ayyuha al-Nas, Ma'shar al-Nas, Ibadallah. Again, depending on context, if it was in a tribal context, it could be Ya Ma'shar al-Ansar, Ya Banu Hashim. Then you go into so you've got the hamdulillah, you've got the transition phase, you've got the sort of direct address, then you've got the main khutbah itself, and then you have the prayer at the end. And again, this is something that instinctively most people would have already memorized. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم, and then a particular prayer. And so we've got this kind of basic, essential structure of what a khutbah should be, but within that, you've got an incredible series of aesthetic tools, but central to all of them, or the most prominent one, are those that facilitate rhythm, which is parallelism is most prominent, is Diwaj. And this is where you have brief or sort of two, sometimes three, sometimes slightly longer, identical or near identical, syntactically structured sentences, usually sort of concise, of 2 to 4 phrases. And this focus on parallelism, now there's a number of aesthetic features, but parallelism, sort of where the sort of 2 phrases are very close in their structure, gives mainly an acoustic effect. But also this acoustic effect is related to how an oral culture works, because it's the rhythm of, it provides a particular pattern. And this in itself becomes majorly influential on, for example, later the later written tradition. And so we see that these features, these aesthetic features of the khutbah. Now, as I said, parallelism is very prominent, but it's just also one. Sometimes you have rhyme, whether it's assonant rhyme or consonant rhyme, but also you have particular rhetorical devices. For example, the use of direct address, the use of rhetorical questions, the use of particular themes related to the imagery of the world around them. And this is something you find very prominent in oral cultures, as in most oral cultures, but also in the culture of the khutbah in the 1st century. So this idea that essentially, rather than abstract ideas, speech in an oral culture will mainly be related to concrete things in this world. So rather than think of, for example, the idea of a circle, the khatib will mention the moon. Or rather than a square, he'll mention the table. And so there was this emphasis on using features from the real world as ways to pin particular ideas and particular notions. And so you have this, and then you also, for example, have other features of style, including citing the Quran, citing poetry within the khutbah as well, citing proverbs, citing hadith. And so altogether, these are all related. These sort of have 2 main functions. The first is memory. By having a particular structure, firstly, but also having this kind of rhythm within that structure, then it's so much of this is inherently designed to facilitate retention because that's how so much of speech in oral societies work. And the second is the context-driven aspect of the khutbah, which is metonymy, in that in a particular speech, there will often be a significant amount of subtle or small references, metonymical references, to greater ideas that are, or sort of greater literary artifacts that are already well known in a culture. And so the orator just can reference a line from the Quran. Interestingly, quite often slightly adjusting the grammatical cases of the words or the word order in order to fit it smoothly into the khutbah. A line of poetry, a particular proverb. Now each of these have much larger meanings, which are already well known. And so by just evoking them, just suggesting them or hinting them, this is something where the part becomes a representative of the larger thing. By just evoking them, then a particular meaning is made in the mind of the audience. And so there's all of these tools are so heavily related to mnemonics on the one hand, metonymy on the other hand, and arise from the oral culture in which the khutbahs are being pronounced. And we find so much of these in the later written tradition, like parallelism, for example, well into the middle of the sort of 15th century. Chancery scribes are telling the next generation of students to write in short parallel sentences in order to facilitate understanding and facilitate comprehension. So yes, yeah, so in terms of, it's just that legacy is quite incredible, I think. I went on for a bit, didn't I?
No, Dr. Al-Khoee, you put me in a really difficult position because my insurance doesn't cover a blown mind. I think some of the things you're saying, it's really triggering so many different associations. I mean, this idea of parallelism is really fascinating because you wonder, I mean, you mentioned the example of the chancery scribes, but you know, if someone is giving a speech in the market using these techniques of parallelism, then is there some kind of trigger? Does it trigger associations with the khutbah for the person that is listening?
No, I think so. Sorry, I think so. I think absolutely, because the defining thing of parallelism is the fact that it's repetitive. And you know, we can almost imagine if we were to sort of just as we're speaking here, we can sort of imagine and say often a thing is better remembered because something twice is better recalled. So too often a thing is better remembered as that thing said twice is better recalled. Two sentences which repeat roughly the same thing. I basically said the same thing twice. But in an oral context, what you're doing is you're allowing the audience, you're sort of adding the same idea in a slightly different way. In order to, and it's so much of this, and all of these aesthetics, by the way, and it's a point I haven't mentioned yet, is related to the idea of persuasion. The central point of the khutbah is to persuade the audience, to whether it's to accept a figure as a khalif or to accept a particular religious injunction. And so within that, you have all of these aesthetic and rhetorical devices, aesthetic features and rhetorical devices, parallelism being central. And we find that, for example, what we would often find is that in the two sentences, the second phrase would often be an echo of the first, but sometimes a slight change of word. And in fact, because the word has been changed and the emphasis is placed on that word, quite often you have this idea of antithesis, or what's known in Arabic as tabaq, where the second phrase would be completely contrasted with the first. And so this parallelism really gives a kind of particular power to the oration, because quite often because of the acoustic effect that's also created, because within that parallelism you have morphological parallelism, sort of where within the same sentence you have structural parallelism, within the same sentence you have all of this repeat of particular case indicators or verbal mood indicators or definite markers or prefixes or the sound endings or the longer or the use of prepositions repeated in the same way. So for example, in one of the reported traditions attributed to Abu Talib in the pre-Islamic period regarding reverence for the Kaaba and why the Kaaba should be revered, and again I'm using this example from Professor Qutbuddin's work, where he says فَإِنَّ فِيهَا مَرْضَاةً لِلرَّبِّ وَقِوَامًا لِلْمَعَاشِ وَثَبَاتًا لِلْوَطْءِ. So he's talking here about why the Kaaba should be revered. فَإِنَّ فِيهَا مَرْضَاةً لِلْرَبِّ وَقِوَامًا لِلْمَعَاشِ وَثَبَاتًا لِلْوَطْءِ. So in the reverence for the Kaaba, there is pleasure for the Lord, there is a kind of constancy for your own livelihood and stability for traveling parties. And so you just see in those three parallel sentences, we have mardatin, qiwaman, thabatan. You have al-rab, al-ma'ash, al-wat'a. You have li, that's repeated a few times. You have the long vowel, the long a vowels in ma'ash, mardat, qiwam, thabat. And so a kind of pattern is created in the minds of the audience. And this is something, the pattern is created because of this kind of the repetitive acoustic effect that we find through this kind of parallelism. And then in the later period, you have, for example, this idea that if you're going to, well, if most public speeches should be heavy on parallelism, but also the written tradition should use this sort of parallel ideas and parallel devices. And then you begin to see, for example, critical statements like, well, if you're going to use 2 or more sentences, then the third sentence should always be longer than the second, and the fourth should be longer than the third, because you want to create a sense of anticipation. And if the fifth is shorter than the first and second, then the audience will be left disappointed because their brain is sort of primed to expect a particular idea or a particular sentence.
Thank you so much for sharing that example. I think it was really instructive just to hear what the khutbah would have sounded like.
I can't do justice to how, firstly, in terms of how this would have sounded, but also just the acoustic effect that's created. Because quite often, whether it's rhyme or whether it's assonance or whether it's all of these kind of varied. So when I started my own thesis, one of the first speeches I read a long time ago, one of the first, and at this point I noticed I was stroking my beard, and Jahad says you shouldn't do that. One of the first speeches I read as I was doing my, when I was doing my sort of the early research, was a speech attributed to Qus bin Sa'ada, who was a pre-Islamic orator, as whatever we mean by pre-Islamic. Some said he's a Christian bishop. There's been some sort of notes that he might have been a legendary figure, but he's considered one of the famous orators of the pre-Islamic Arabs. And it's strange because I think I only read it, and again, that's not having heard it, only read it once, and just one line, just the acoustic effect was beautiful. So he starts, and he's very much giving a khutbah in the tradition of sort of pious homiletic exhortation. And so he says, he starts with Ayyuhan nas isma'u wa'u, O people, listen and sort of retain what I'm saying to you. Man aasha mat, wa man mata fat, wa kullu ma huwa atin at. Whoever lives, man aasha mat, whoever lives will die. Wa man mata fat, and whoever dies has sort of is lost. Wa kullu ma huwa atin at, and whatever will be, will be. And apparently, according to some accounts in the tradition, Qus bin Sa'ada was the Prophet Muhammad, one of the Prophet Muhammad's famous orators, who used to go and listen to his speeches. But just that kind of rhythmic man aasha mat, man mata fat, wa kullu ma huwa atin at, it just found a place and just stayed there. And then, but when he sort of continues, when Qus moves on to continue with his speech, you find this kind of man asha mat wa man mata fat wa kullu ma huwa atun at laylun daj wa naharun saj wa sama'un dhatu abraj wa nujumun tahzar wa baharun tazkhar wa jibalun mursaha wa jibalun mursah. My memory isn't as good as it was. And so you get this, and this is just one of, I think, sort of, hundreds of particularly famous khutbas that have that kind of pronounced, powerful effect. Some for their beauty, as in, for example, the speeches of Imam Ali. Some for their, we can call them almost horror. Because, and this is what Patricia Crowler calls the blood-curdling speeches of the Umayyad governors of Iraq, where in their threats, for example, especially attributed to, in their threats to the Kufans and the Iraqis, especially, so the famous speech of Al-Hajjaj, for example, where he says, I see long necks and heads that have ripened, whose time for plucking has arrived. I am the person for it. And he goes on to see them, that he goes, I already see blood dripping between your turbans and your beards. And again, done in parallelism, done in rhyme, the kind of effect that has is incredible. Battlefield speeches, I think, again, this was one that sort of stuck with me quite early on, was the speech of Tariq bin Ziyad when the Umayyad army crossed the Straits of Gibraltar for the first time. And you have in the accounts, whether this legendary or not, that once they cross the Straits of Gibraltar, Tariq bin Ziyad burns the ships, or the ships are burnt. But then he gives this incredible speech that, according to the tradition, he gives this incredible speech to the army where he says, Ayyuhan nas ayna al-mafar. He goes, oh, people, where will you flee to? Al-bahru min waraikum. Al-bahru min waraikum wal-aduwu amamikum. The sea is behind you and your enemy is in front of you. وَلَيْسَ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهِ إِلَّا الصِّدْقُ وَالصَّبْرُ. So there's nothing for you except truth and patience. And so it's interesting that even this particular phrase, al-bahru min waraikum wal-aduwu amamikum, later becomes in fact later is quite commonly today used as a proverb, to essentially mean between a rock and a hard place, where the only way now is to fight. And so for all of these, I think, from their beauty to their horror to their power, that acoustic effect, that aesthetic effect is central.
Dr. Khoee, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, and for those speeches at the end. I think those were really illuminating just to hear them. It forms a mantra. Sorry.
One of the things that I think we lose is, for me, quite often, occasionally I try to commit some of these to memory, but it's never been more than a handful. And so the elder generations, and some of my uncles used to tell us that back in Iraq, a game they used to play when they were kids, this is a kid's game, was somebody used to recite a line of Arabic poetry, and the next kid has to start another line beginning with the last letter, or the last consonant which the last line ended with. And they play this for hours. Firstly, I used to think, okay. But yeah, I think that just that ability to sort of, and I think when it comes to a craft, one of the things was that ability to memorize, and then that ability to, I think there's a very strong tradition of imbuing within the kind of mind, within the body, the mastery of other masters, of other master orators, and see what they've done and just memorize and learn what they've done. And through that process, through a kind of osmotic process, we find sort of the ability instilled within the individual themselves.
What was I doing? What games was I playing at that age? Pokemon.
Yeah. I was throwing rocks at other rocks.
Yeah. Dr. Khoee, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for
having me.
having
It's a real pleasure to speak to you, and I've learned so much. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your patience, and for sharing your research with us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.